Chapter 16. The Other Historians. Dak was half asleep and completely aware that he was dreaming, but the dream was a good one, so he kept his eyes closed and followed along with the story. He was at Sera's birthday party just outside her barn, and her uncle had just blindfolded him and handed him a stick. He spun Dak around several times and then let go, saying, "Let her rip." Dak staggered a little, dizzy, then started hacking at the swinging piñata, which he knew was somewhere in front of him. He missed twice, then connected on his third try. On his fourth swing, he reared back and whacked the piñata with all his strength, feeling the side cave in. He could hear the candy start pouring out. When Dak ripped off the blindfold, he saw that it wasn't candy at all. It was blocks of high-end cheese, all different kinds and sizes. They looked beautiful streaming out into the thick summer grass. The other kids were already converging with their empty pillowcases, scooping the cheese blocks up with 2 hands and shoving them inside. And Dak shouted, "Hey, wait for me! I have to get my pillowcase!" But he couldn't find his pillowcase, not anywhere. And all the while, more and more kids raced past him, pouncing on what was left from the piñata he broke open. "Wake up," he heard Sera whispering in his ear. "But they're taking all my cheese," he told her. "Dak, wake up," she whispered, louder this time. He opened his eyes, and he saw all the imprisoned Mayas quietly filing out the open door of the prison cell. Sera pulled him to his feet, and they joined the line, and soon they were sneaking past 2 sleeping monks, ducking out of the building and hurrying into the night. Dak followed Sera over to where Rick was standing. Rick pointed toward the towering observatory, and without saying a word, the 3 of them split off from the others and hurried through the village in that direction. As they ran, Dak kept looking all around, worried someone might hop out of the bushes and snatch them up. He saw several monks milling around in the square, though it was too dark to see what they were doing. He saw a giant wooden cross leaning up against one of the huts. He saw storm clouds gathering in the distant sky. Rick opened the observatory doors, ushered Dak and Sera inside, then led them to the far corner of the large room, where Dak glanced up at the open roof. The 3 of them stood there for several quiet seconds, hands on knees, trying to catch their breath and looking all around them. Sera was the first to straighten back up. She took in a deep breath and said to Rick, "How'd you know the answer was friendship?" Rick took his hands off his knees, too. "A conversation I had with Kisa," he said, linking his fingers on top of his head and taking a few more deep breaths. Dak pulled the square out of his breechcloth and said, "Dude, that was almost 1,000 years ago. How could it possibly apply to today?" Rick shook his head. "Trust me, I was just as surprised as you guys." Dak powered on the square and brought up the latest riddle, which Rick had yet to see. "Before we look at this, I just want to say something, okay? It seems like something really messed up is happening here, something other than the break." Dak looked at Sera. "Once we fix what we're supposed to fix, if you guys want to help these people in some other way, I'm totally open to that." Sera gave him a small smile and said, "Thanks, Dak. Let's concentrate on the break for now. We can discuss everything else later on." Dak realized it was the first time he'd seen Sera smile in a long time. "I just know it's important to you," he said. "It is." Rick cleared his throat. "I wanted to say something, too. It was wrong of me to just wander off like that. I apologize. I also want to assure you I'm as committed to our mission as I've ever been." "We know you are," Sera said. Dak patted Rick on the shoulder. "It's cool, dude. Just remember, love is a tricky game, moving right along," Sera said, pointing at the square in Dak's hand. "Oh, right." Dak turned the screen around so Rick and Sera could see. "We were thinking you might be able to help us with this second riddle, Rick." Dak silently reread the words upside down. "To save the reproduction of the treasure's truth, do the following. Seek the help of those who follow the most important thing in the world, then dig deep, deeper, deepest, unlocking a long-locked door. It will take a polyglot to understand the wisdom of the glyphs. and the forgery of the curse. "So, we're supposed to find people who follow friendship?" Rick said. "Apparently, we already did," Dak said. Everyone in the holding cell knew the answer to that question. Well, everyone but Sera. "Ha ha," Sera said, rolling her eyes. "All of the Mayas in the cell had been in the cave earlier, too, which means they're proud of their Mayan roots, right?" "Exactly." Dak turned to Rick and said, "We learned from Bacab that the monks have caused a split among the Mayan people. Some are embracing the Spanish influence. Others want to remain loyal to ancient Mayan ways." "So this break," Sera said, pointing at Dak, "has to center around something they have stashed in that cave, most likely Bacal's codex," Dak said. "It's not in the cave anymore," Rick said. "According to Bacab's little brother, everything's been cleared out. He told me the monks confiscated it all." Dak smacked his own forehead with the heel of his hand. "Dude, I just realized something. Did you guys see the monks in the square on the way over here?" Rick and Sera both nodded. Dak turned to Rick. "Back in the cell, Bacab explained that every hut with a secret friendship sculpture out front was storing ancient Mayan artifacts. The problem is, over the past several weeks, they've been transferring everything up to the cave. They thought that would be safer." Sera's eyes grew big. "They're piling everything into the square," she shouted. "They're planning to burn it." "Bingo," Dak said. "And that bonfire, my friend, is what's otherwise known as an auto de fe." They all just stared at one another, mouths hanging open in shock, until Dak said, "We have to stop it. Bacal's codex has to be preserved. That's got to be the break, right? Which means the one that has survived history is a fake." Sera took the square out of Dak's hands and held it out to Rick. "Do you understand anything else in the riddle?" "A polyglot is someone who can speak or write multiple languages," he said, looking up at Sera. "Like you, dude," Dak said. Rick nodded. "So we need Rick's language ability," Sera said, "in order to understand the wisdom of the glyphs and the forgery of the curse." She patted Rick on the back. "We're sure glad you came back." Dak sensed Rick might be feeling a little too good about himself. He opened his mouth to say something sarcastic, but just then he heard someone entering through the front door of the observatory. Dak snatched the square from Sera and shoved it back into his breechcloth. "Quick," Rick said. "Follow me." He pulled a candle out of its holder on the wall and started toward one of the doors. Dak and Sera followed Rick through the door and down a narrow staircase. Then the three of them crept slowly through a dark hall, Rick leading the way with his candle. Dak wasn't sure the basement was the best idea until he spotted an open door at the opposite end. Rick stopped right in front of it, waiting for Dak and Sera to catch up. Then the three of them looked inside. There was a tall Mayan woman sitting in a chair, holding a wooden box in her lap, and grinning. Dak saw she had a birthmark on her cheek. "I've been waiting for you three," she said. Dak let Rick and Sera take the two empty chairs, and he stood behind them, studying the Mayan woman and the wooden box in her lap. There were a number of ancient Mayan artifacts inside, including several lockets that resembled the one he'd given to Rick. The woman got up to close the door, and then sat back down and said, "I'm just going to come out and ask. Are you from the future?" Dak, Sera, and Rick all looked at one another. Then Dak turned back to the woman and said, "We are, ma'am." The woman covered her mouth, and her eyes turned glassy. "I knew it," she said, pointing at Rick. "As soon as you showed up earlier this evening in that ill-fitting robe, I had this strange feeling in my stomach." She shook her head and said, "Wow, I did not expect to be having this conversation tonight." "My turn to ask a question," Dak said. "Are you a historian?" "I am." "What about those two other ladies?" Rick asked. "The ones you were sitting with earlier?" "No, it's just me now." She covered her mouth again, briefly, then took a deep breath and said, "Forgive me, I just..." I never thought I'd actually live to see the day." "Finally," Dak said, turning to Sera and Rick. "I was beginning to think there weren't any historians in all of Mesoamerica." "Oh no," the woman said. "We're here, just extremely spread out. In fact, this region is actually the birthplace of the historian presence in the Americas." "The first historian in the Americas was Mayan?" Sera said. "Who? When?" "An amazing woman known as Akna," she answered. "A long, long time ago. By the way, I'm Maria."
"Maria?" Dak said. "That doesn't sound very Mayan to me."
"It's not. My parents passed away when I was an infant, and I was raised by Spanish nuns. They're the ones who named me. When I got older, I began researching my Mayan roots, which is how I stumbled into the underground historian movement. I joined immediately, hoping I could help make tomorrow's world a better and safer place."
Dak, Sera, and Rick introduced themselves to Maria, and then Rick pulled 2 locket pieces out of the bag on his belt and held them out. "I came in here earlier because of this."
"Dude, you broke my gift," Dak said.
"That hurts."
"See what's written inside there?" Rick said, turning the locket toward Dak.
"How about a little help?"
Dak said. "You know I can't read glyphs." Rick turned the locket halves toward Maria, who said a single word. "Observatory."
"We were in this same village a long time ago," Rick told her, "and I knew a girl named Kisa. She tried to give me a locket like this one when we were leaving, but I dropped it. That's why I was asking about her earlier tonight. So, you're sure you've never heard of her?"
Maria shook her head and told him, "But I need to show you something fascinating." She dug into the wooden box, pulling out several similar-looking ancient lockets. "Each of you take one and open it up," she said. Dak opened his and looked at the glyph inside. It was exactly like the one Rick had just shown him. Rick and Sera held out their open lockets, too.
"They all say observatory," Rick said.
"We are constantly finding more and more lockets," Maria said. "And they all have the same word inside. We still don't understand why." Sera set her locket down. "Kisa was really trying to tell you something, Rick."
He shrugged, but didn't say anything. Dak could tell the guy was feeling all sensitive again. He made a mental note to lead Rick through a quick seminar on love as soon as they could carve out the free time.
"We always assumed the author of these messages was Akna," Maria said. "That is why previous historians established the observatory as their base. According to legend, Akna was so committed to our cause, she worked all the way up until the day she passed away from old age."
"Whoever wrote it," Dak said, "why were they being so vague?"
"She probably worried the information would get into the wrong hands," Sera said. "Where there are historians, there are usually time wardens, too." "Of course," Maria said. Then she stood up. "Come with me. I'd like to show the 3 of you something else." Dak, Sera, and Rick followed Maria halfway down the hall until she stopped, knelt down, and shone her candlelight on a lower portion of the wall. She felt with her fingers along the wall until she came to a small keyhole. "I've never mentioned this to anyone," she said, looking up. "There's a locked door here. It's been this way at least as far back as I go, but we believe there's a secret room behind this wall. According to legend, it was the meeting place of the first ever historians in this part of the world, led, of course, by our remarkable founder, Akna." Dak saw 2 tiny snakes were carved into the stone near the keyhole. "Check it out," he said. Sera turned to Rick, who had tensed at the sight. "Could 2 people be that into snakes?" she asked.
"We have to get inside," Rick said.
Sera nodded. "The riddle says we're supposed to unlock a long locked door," she said. "This has to be it." Dak pressed on the small stone door, then tried to rattle it.
"Deep, deeper, deepest," he said.
He was getting excited, thinking about all the historian history that might be on the other side of the stone wall. "Talk to us, Maria.
How do we open this bad boy?"
"There is no key," Maria said. "Many generations of historians have stood in this very place, wishing they could see what's inside, but locked out we have remained."
"Bacab!" Dax shouted, springing to his feet. "We have to track that dude down ASAP! He's a locksmith!"
Chapter 17. The Way Events Unfolded. It didn't take long for Sera to see what the Mayan people were up against. As she, Dak, and Rick hurried away from the observatory, they passed the village square where several Franciscan monks were tossing ancient Mayan artifacts onto a massive pile. It was dawn now, so Sera could see it all clearly. A few monks were tucking kindling into the pile. 24 or so armed Spanish men stood in a circle around the monks, almost daring village locals to interfere. Sera noticed that all the guards from the prison were part of the circle. So were the men who'd forced the Mayas out of the cave. One monk seemed to be overseeing the entire operation. Sera studied him as they moved past the scene. She knew he must be the infamous Diego de Landa. Bacab wasn't at his hut. They found him at a nearby ball court, huddled with several other Mayan men, including his younger cousin, Kinich. "Bacab," Sera said, half out of breath. "Have you seen what the monks are doing in the square?" "I know what they're doing, little sister." He turned around, showing the crossbow in his hands. "It is why we are preparing for battle." "But they're sitting there waiting for you," Sera shouted. "And they're heavily armed," Rick added. "If they try to burn our history, we will stand up against them," Bacab said. He grinned at Sera. "I'm not afraid to risk my life for what's right." Then he turned back to his men and began barking instructions. She spun around to face Dak and Rick. "I have to help them," she said. "Sera, we need you," Rick said. "The best way to help them," Dak said, "is to fix this break. We can change the way the world perceives the Mayan people forever." Sera was so confused. She felt a strange, unexplainable loyalty toward these people, like they were family. And if they were willing to risk their lives, she felt like she should too. But the rational side of Sera knew Dak was right. If they fixed the break, made sure the right codex survived the burning, the Maya would no longer be famous for declaring the SQ saviors of the world. Maybe instead they'd be celebrated for their actual wisdom and scientific achievements. Sera never thought she'd consider the Maya scientific, but that's exactly what they were. She turned back to Bacab. "We need your help getting into a room in the observatory." "Can it wait until after our battle in the square?" Kinich said, frowning at her. "You may have noticed Bacab is a little preoccupied at the moment." "I'm sorry, but it can't wait," Sera said flatly. "Bacab, do you have keys to the doors in the observatory basement?" "If it is a lock in this village," Bacab said, "I have the key." "And what is in the basement?" Kinich asked. "There's a room we think might be very important to us," Dak said. Bacab stood there, looking out over the horizon. "It would be much easier if this could wait." "Or you could just give us the keys," Dak suggested. "We'd bring them back as soon as we were done." "Only a locksmith handles a locksmith's keys," Bacab said. "I will take them," Kinich said, tossing down the coil of rope he'd been holding. He picked up his crossbow and said, "Bacab, you stay here and continue your preparations. I will hurry back." "You'll really take us?" Dak asked. "Obviously you're desperate," Kinich said. "So we will go." "You know where the keys are," Bacab said. "Come back as soon as you can. We will need every man this morning." Kinich took off in a jog toward Bacab's hut. Sera, Dak, and Rick were right on his heels. Kinich was a very calm and composed man. That was what stood out most to Sera as they walked past the village square on their way back to the observatory. Dak and Rick were a few steps behind, talking, so Sera was free to watch Kinich as he studied the Spanish men guarding the pile of Mayan artifacts. He showed no emotion.
Doesn't it bother you?" Sera asked him. "It bothers me very much," Kinich said, "because it is unjust and ignorant. They do not wish to tolerate what they do not understand." Sera shook her head. "If I had that crossbow you're wearing, I'd be tempted to fire off a few arrows right about now." Kinich only smiled at her. Once the square was well behind them, he said, "I would like to tell you the story of two boys." It seemed like an odd time to tell a story, but Sera thought Kinich was intriguing, so she told him, "I'd love to hear a story." "Wait," Dak said. "What story? We want to hear the story too." "Many years ago," Kinich began, "two young boys went out on a raft with one of the most respected elders of their village. This would be both boys' first fishing trip. One of them was the son of the king. The other was a neighborhood boy who the king's son was fond of. They went out into the deeps where the fish were known to bite. The neighborhood boy took to fishing right away. He caught 3 fish within the first hour. The king's son didn't fare quite as well. He had trouble casting his line. The elder assured him it was simply bad luck. A little while later, the weather began to change." Kinich paused as he swung open the observatory door and held out his hand for Sera, Dak, and Rick to enter. "What happened next?" Dak asked as soon as they were all inside. Sera had no idea how the story applied to anything she'd said, but she was curious too. "The elder told the boys they must head for shore right away," Kinich continued. "But the king's son had other ideas. He demanded that they remain in the ocean until he caught a fish too. He threatened to tell his father if the elder failed to respect his wishes. You would lose your standing in the village, he said. The elder pointed to the swirling sky and told the king's son they were in danger, and he began paddling toward the shore. They were at the stairs now, and Kinich descended them slowly. On their way in, he said, the sea grew very rough. A powerful wave rose up and slammed into the wooden raft. The neighborhood boy's fish all washed back into the ocean. Then a second wave appeared, this one bigger and stronger. It picked up the small raft and slammed it back down against the sea. The raft collapsed underneath them, leaving the two boys and the elder alone in the rough water, with nothing to keep them afloat. It was a desperate situation for the elder. Neither boy could swim, and he knew he would only have the strength to save one boy. He turned to them, both thrashing around, fighting to keep their heads above water. It was an impossible dilemma. He cared for both boys. But when another large swell rose up in the sea behind them, the elder chose. He grabbed the shirt of the neighborhood boy and held tight as the waves crashed over the top of them, forcing them both underwater. He fought against the current and made it to the surface, holding the boy's face out of the water. Then he swam with his one free hand toward the shore, and eventually they made it. Sera stopped at the bottom of the stairs. What happened to the king's son? Did he die? You can't leave us hanging, Dak said. Sera noticed that Rick seemed far less interested. She tapped the back of his elbow and mouthed, You okay? He nodded. The king's son washed ashore several minutes later, Kinich said. He had drowned. The elder told the truth that night when the king came to see him. He said he understood in the sea that he would only be able to save one boy, and he had chosen the neighborhood boy. The king ordered the elder to be put to death the following morning. Just before the elder was to be sacrificed, the neighborhood boy snuck over to the holding cell, sobbing, and begged the elder to tell him why he hadn't chosen the king's son. And do you know what the elder said? What? Dak said. Tell us. Kinich glanced at Sera and smiled. He told the boy that he knew the choice he made in the sea would be negative in the short term. He would pay with his life. But in the long term, he believed it would prove to be the most beneficial. How is that possible? The boy cried. Because tomorrow, the elder explained, you are going to go see a group of people who are very important to me, and you're going to listen to what they have to say. And if my instincts are correct,
You will carry their important message into future generations." Maria came hurrying out of the room at the end of the hall, holding a candle. "You found the key?" she asked. Kinich held up the massive key ring for her to see. Then he began sifting through them, looking for the right one. Sera watched nervously as the first two keys he tried failed to work. "So, I must have missed something," Dak said to Sera. "Why was he telling that story?" "He's right here," Sera said. "Why don't you ask him?" "How about it, Kenichi?" Dak said. Kinich was too preoccupied to answer. The third and fourth keys failed as well, but the fifth slid right into the lock and turned easily. Kinich shoved open the heavy stone door, saying, "After you, my friends." Sera was the first one inside. She expected to see all kinds of Mayan artifacts, but the room was completely empty. She walked to the far wall, studying the floor along the way. It looked like there were fresh drag marks. "I don't understand," Maria said. "According to all the records, this is the room." "Looks like you got some bad intel," Dak said. Rick tapped Sera on the arm and motioned back at Kinich, who was still hovering by the door. "Are we sure we trust—" "I'll tell you the point of the story," Kinich interrupted, gripping the top of the door frame. Everyone turned to look at him. "Sometimes we must do things that are detrimental in the short term, because you know they will prove advantageous in the long term. There is nothing left in this room because I cleared it all out. The artifacts you thought you'd find are at the bottom of the pile in the village square." Maria fell to her knees. "What are you saying, Kinich?" she cried. The realization hit Sera like a ton of bricks. "He's a time warden," she said. Dak started marching toward Kinich with his fists clenched, but Kinich only smiled as he pulled an arrow from the pouch on his shoulder. He loaded it into his crossbow and raised it at Dak, who stopped in his tracks. "I am a proud Maya," Kinich said, "and in the short term it will be painful to see the legacy of my people turned into ash. See, Diego de Landa will only allow one codex to survive for historical purposes. It shall be the only legacy of the Mayan people. He selected a codex from ancient Itzamal, written by a legendary scribe named Pakal. But we have composed our own codex, which reveals the SQ as the rightful savior of the world. It is a perfect opportunity to spread our message far and wide. For the long term, this is what has to be done." "You're selling out your own people," Sera shouted. "I'm advancing an ideology," Kinich said. "Now please, hand over what's in your satchel. From the second I saw you two enter the holding cell, I suspected you might be from the future." "Is Delanda a time warden too?" Dak asked. Kinich looked appalled. "That man could never be part of our movement. He's too blinded by religious zealotry. But he'll make a fine tool." He turned back to Sera. "Now hand over your time travel device." "I'll never give it to you," Sera said through her gritted teeth. Kinich pointed the arrow right at her forehead. "You have 3 seconds," he said, pulling back on the cocking stirrup. Rick ripped open Sera's satchel, pulled out the ring, and set it on the ground in front of her. "No!" Sera screamed as Kinich reached down to pick it up. He backed through the doorway, lowering his crossbow. "In case you were wondering," he said, "the neighborhood boy in the story was me. Sometimes destiny finds the man, instead of the man finding his destiny. If the elder who saved my life had been a historian instead of a time warden, who knows? I may have been on your side. But that is not the way events unfolded." Kinich slammed closed the stone door, and Sera heard the click of the lock. Chapter 18. Follow the Snakes. Rick cursed himself as he watched Sera pound the stone wall with the undersides of her fists. Why hadn't he trusted his instincts? From the second Kinnich had volunteered to accompany them to the observatory, Rick had been skeptical of his motivation. Before that even, when he'd asked Sera what she was looking for in the observatory basement. And that story about the two boys in the sea, Rick had sensed all along that something wasn't right. But he had done nothing to stop it. Zero. And now look where they were. He watched Maria pacing all around the room with her candle, watched Dak sit against the wall, letting his face fall into his hands. Sera turned around with a panicked look on her face and said, "What now? We'll never get out of here." She looked right at Rick. "Why'd you let him have the ring?"
"I couldn't let him hurt you," Rick said.
"I'd rather take an arrow in the chest than be stuck in here forever," she said. "They're probably torching Pakal's codex as we speak," Dak said. "You know, the one we were supposed to protect." "I've always known there was an SQ present here," Maria said. "But I never once considered Bakab's cousin." "So what are we supposed to do?" Sera said. "Sit here and wait for our air to run out? Because that's what'll probably happen." Dak, Sera, and Maria continued on like this, as Rick began walking around the room, studying every inch of the dark walls. Maria's candle gave just enough light that he could see. After several minutes, he spotted something that made the hairs on his arm stand up. A tiny snake had been carved into one of the stones. Then another snake, even smaller, on the stone below it. "And why are you so quiet?" Dak shouted at Rick's back. "You don't care that we're all going to die in this tomb?" Rick ignored Dak and kept scanning farther down the wall. He found a third snake, then a fourth. "I know you hear me, lover boy." "Leave him alone, Dak," Sera said. "Just please be quiet for once in your life." "What did I do to you?" Dak snapped back at her. Maria moved in closer to Rick and held her candle to the wall so he could see better. "What are you looking at?" she asked. "There's a pattern of tiny engravings on the wall," Rick told her. "They go all the way down to the floor." Sera came to look at them too. "They're snakes," she said. "Hold on a sec. Dak, get over here with the square." "Oh, I can't even get a please now?" Rick turned around, saw Sera take the square from Dak, power it on, and quickly pull up the riddle. "Dig deep, deeper, deepest," she read. She looked up at Rick and Dak and said, "What if this isn't the deepest room in the observatory?" "Kisa's trying to tell us something," Rick said, scanning stones again. The tiny snake engravings clearly descended all the way down the wall, but the stone closest to the floor had two snakes. Maybe that stone was the most significant. He dropped to his knees and began feeling all around the stone, but it felt no different than the others. "What is it?" Dak asked. "I don't know yet," Rick told him. He stood up and studied every stone that had a snake on it, starting up near the ceiling. He had to figure this out. What was Kisa trying to tell him? All he saw was a solid stone wall. "Is there a hidden door or something?" Sera asked. "What am I not seeing?" Rick mumbled to himself. He felt all around the stones on either side of the ones with snakes. Then he studied the actual engravings, but nothing stood out to him. He grew so frustrated, he stood up and punched the wall with a closed fist, which really hurt. So he kicked the stone with two snakes. A strange thing happened. The stone he kicked moved a few centimeters into the wall. Rick turned to look at Dak and Sera, their eyes wide with anticipation. Rick knelt down and pushed the stone farther and farther into the wall until it revealed a small latch. Rick undid the latch and moved a thick piece of leather to the side to grab the handle underneath. He pulled on it with all his strength. All of a sudden, a small part of the floor came up, revealing a narrow opening that led to a dark staircase. They all looked at each other, and Sera repeated, "Deep, deeper, deepest." "This is amazing!" Dax shouted. "I should have been an architect." The four of them climbed down the narrow stairs, one at a time, Rick now holding Maria's candle to light the way. When he got to the bottom, he held up the candle and scanned the small room. There was an old wooden desk and a chair. The walls were full of glyphs. The shelves around the desk were covered with rusted lockets and antiquated paintbrushes. "Oh, wow," Sera said behind him. "What?" Dax said. Rick followed Sera's eyes to the floor underneath the desk where there was a full skeleton. His eyes grew big, and he walked over to it and leaned down to get a better look with the candle. There was an open locket near the skeleton's hand. Inside, the glyph for observatory was only half finished. He fell to his knees near the skeleton, fighting back tears. He knew in his heart it had to be Kisa. "Guys!" Dax shouted. Rick spun around, saw that Dax was holding a codex in his hands. "Is that what I think it is?" Sera asked. Rick pulled himself together, got up, and walked over to Dax. He looked at the first panel of the codex, and there it was, the symbol of the ceiba tree. The writing looked slightly different from Pakal's, which told Rick it was a reproduction. He looked up as Sera quoted from the riddle. "To save the reproduction of the treasure's truth." "A copy of Pakal's codex! We found it!" Dax said. He took the candle from Rick and circled it all around the room. "Do you know how incredible this is? There probably hasn't been another living soul in this place for hundreds and hundreds of years, at least since she kicked the bucket, right?" He pointed at the skeleton. "I'd assume if anyone found her, they'd give her a proper burial." "I can't believe it," Maria said. "All along, this has been under my feet." Rick took the candle from Dax and put it in the candle holder on the wall. Now, the entire room was dimly lit. You guys?" Sera said, pointing at the far wall. "I just found a glyph etched into a stone near this handle. Can you read it, Rick?" Rick moved closer to her and read the glyph. "It's an exit," he said. "Are you kidding me?" Dax started jumping up and down. "There's another way out of here. This snake woman was a genius." "Easy," Sera warned him. "Let's make sure we can get out before we start patting ourselves on the back. Even then, we still have a lot of work to do switching codices with the monks." "Come on, Sera," Dax said. "Where's that positive attitude?" Dax, Sera, and Maria started trying to turn the handle built into the wall. They barely got it to budge. Sera called out, "Rick, get over here and help us. This thing's rusted in place." Rick ignored her because he'd just spotted a thin block of wood with a series of painted glyphs. It looked like a letter, placed on the desk for someone to find. Rick picked it up and began reading, his heart now thumping inside his chest. "Dear future historian, if you are reading this note, it means you have found your way into the birthplace of the historians movement among our people. When I was just a girl, the king of Itzamal promised me a secret room below the basement of his new observatory where I could organize a historian presence. But the king didn't stop there. He built a secret room underneath the secret room. A great many discussions have taken place between these walls. But now I am old, and I fear the end is near. I ask that you help get this message into the hands of the time travelers that may happen to pass through our village a second time. I initiated the historian presence here because when I was young, I encountered these 3 time travelers, and it changed the course of my life. They came during the Great Storm, and they helped the king maintain possession of our most sacred tool of learning, Pakal's codex. Thousands of young students have been taught from this codex during my lifetime. I can't imagine our village without it." Rick tried to swallow the lump in his throat. He looked up, saw Dax, Sera, and Maria all straining to turn the rusted handle. He then looked all around the room and glanced down at the skeleton again. All of it seemed so surreal. Kisa's presence,
her bones beneath the desk. He remembered the young girl he'd sat with at the mouth of the cave. She was so smart and pretty. She made him want to be somebody. And then, in the time it took to snap his fingers, Rick had warped to a different time, and the girl from Itzamal had lived an entire life and grown old and died. He turned back to the letter, overwhelmed with emotion. All my life, I'd longed to do something special. When I was young, I believed it was art and jewelry, but that changed when I met the time travelers. They arrived with one mission: to save the world. And I realized one day that I could help them by continuing their work. I have been a defender of scholars, and a scholar myself. I have traveled to faraway villages with the message of peace and cooperation. I have warned Almaya to stay vigilant and to oppose the SQ whenever they might appear on our shores. The small group of local young people I have trained now refer to me as Akna, after the goddess of motherhood. Even though I never had a child of my own, the name stuck. Most of them went off to other villages to extend our presence. I have done this for over 50 years now. It is my legacy. And I owe my life as a historian to one beautiful young time traveler who walked into my uncle's hut during the great storm. "Rick, come on!" Sera shouted. "We got this bad boy open!" Dak shouted. "No thanks to you!" Rick looked up from the letter, saw Dak, Sera, and Maria slowly pulling open the door. Behind it, he saw yet another set of narrow stone stairs. "1 second," he managed to call out to them, and then he turned to the last paragraph of the letter. "Please, future historian, if you ever happen across these 3 time travelers, deliver this message to the one named Rick. Tell him my life would never have been what it is if I hadn't spent those 3 days with him. Tell him he made me believe I could be anything. Tell him he gave me the strength to insist he leave Itzamal and continue with his mission, even though I cried for 6 weeks after with a broken heart. It was the most important decision I ever made, because the world could not be saved without him. And last, future historian, if this time traveler named Rick ever comes back to Itzamal, tell him that Kisa will always remember him, even after I am gone from this earth, because if it wasn't for our powerful friendship, I never would have fulfilled my destiny as a historian." "Come on, Rick!" Sera shouted again. Rick looked up at her, his chest so full it felt like it might burst. The door was open, and Dak and Maria were already climbing the stairs. "What's wrong with you?" Sera said. "We have to replace the SQ codex and get back the ring." Rick nodded, set the piece of wood back on the desk, and hurried toward Sera. Before he followed her up the stairs, he took one last look around Kisa's secret room. He remembered seeing her for the first time inside Ichik's hut. That strange feeling in his stomach when their eyes first met. Finally, he understood what it meant. Rick turned and hurried up the dark stairs, knowing that nothing could stop him now. He was a historian, just like Kisa was a historian. And from this point on, he would be as committed to the mission as she had been. Chapter 19. Loverboy Strikes Back. Dak heaved open the heavy metal hatch, popped his head above the tall grass, and sucked in a deep breath of fresh air. The first thing he saw was smoke billowing into the sky. The monks were already torching everything. Then he noticed the sky itself, which was dull and gray and filled with angry-looking storm clouds. The secret underground staircase had led to almost the exact spot where they'd warped in, just behind the observatory, in an overgrown patch of wild grass. Dak thought back to when they first arrived and how he'd hardly noticed the grass.
Little did he know that it hid a secret passageway that would save their lives. He switched the codex to his left hand and reached down to help Maria up through the hatch. Then he helped Sera. He stared down into the darkness for a few long seconds, right hand extended, waiting for Rick, but the staircase remained empty. He turned to Sera. "Where's Loverboy?" At that exact moment, Rick came springing up out of the darkness. Dak noticed the newfound look of determination on the guy's face. Probably because he got to snoop through all of Snake Girl's stuff. He made another mental note about that love seminar he wanted to lead. "They've already started," Sera said, pointing at the smoke. "Let's go fix a break," Dak said, and he took off running toward the square with the codex tucked under his arm like a football. When he glanced back a few seconds into his run, he saw that Sera, Rick, and Maria were right on his heels. When they got to the village square, Dak ducked behind a tree to catch his breath and study what was going on. The others sidled up next to him. There was a massive contained fire burning, its flames shooting 20 feet into the air. Many Mayan people were standing all around the fire, watching their history go up in smoke. Some were holding one another and crying. Others were shouting at the monks. A few were being led away from the square in shackles. One monk stood at the center of the entire spectacle, waving around a codex as he shouted over the commotion about heaven and hell and the deceitfulness of the devil. Dak couldn't believe the surreal quality of the proceedings. The raging fire and the billowing smoke, Delanda's passionate preaching, the storm clouds hovering ominously over everything, occasionally lit up by a lightning flash. Back home, Dak had always been drawn to the darker moments of history. He'd climb his favorite tree and read for hours about executions and wars and coups. He could still remember the day he encountered an article about Delanda's auto de fe, which wiped out at least 40 Mayan codices and over 20,000 cult images. It had amazed him that a monk could be responsible for the torching of an entire civilization's history. But only now did he understand the depth of the man's actions. You just had to look at the faces of the Mayan people watching. It made Dak feel sick to his stomach. "There they are," Sera said, pointing to the right of the fire. "Bacab and his men. They're coming." Dak saw them marching toward the village square, a few antiquated weapons cocked and loaded. He understood they'd be no match for the Spanish. Then he spotted Kinich walking right alongside the brave Mayas, everyone oblivious to the fact that he was using this cultural genocide as an opportunity to advance the SQ agenda. Dak turned to the others and shouted over the growing commotion. "The monk who's preaching is obviously Diego de Landa!" "And now it will all be burned," De Landa shouted at the crowd. "And your souls will be cleansed of evil, making it possible for you to see the truth. There is no other way. I will keep only this one document so future leaders of the church can know what led an entire people to live in darkness." "He has no idea he's waving around a fake codex," Sera said. Dak held up the reproduction of Pakal's codex. "We have to make the switch, without him knowing, of course, because he'd never trust us." "I'll do it," Rick said. "I'm the only one dressed like a monk." A shot rang out. Dak spun around, saw one of Bacab's men fall to the ground, holding his chest and choking on his own blood. Another shot was fired. Another man fell. "They're shooting people!" Sera shouted. Bacab and the rest of his men scattered, taking cover behind trees and boulders and nearby huts. The scene grew louder, with weapons being fired and people yelling and thunder pounding in the sky. Dak turned back to his friends. "Listen to me," he shouted. "Rick, same plan as in 638. You hide this one in your robe. I'm going to swipe the one De Landa's holding. You chase me down like you're one of them, and we'll switch, okay?" Rick nodded. "They'll shoot you, Dak," Sera cried. "It's far too dangerous," Maria shouted. Dak looked up when a light rain started to fall. "Kisa did her part," he told them. "Now it's time to do ours." He winked at Rick and moved out from behind the tree. Thunder crashed overhead as Dak snuck closer to Delanda and the fire. He could already feel the heat seeping into his skin. As soon as Delanda turned his back, still ranting about the devil, Dak darted toward him. One of the Spaniards shouted at Dak. Another turned and fired an arrow that whistled past Dak's left ear. Delanda turned around just as Dak got to him, but Dak acted quickly, knocking the codex out of his hand, scooping it up, and sprinting away. 2 more arrows whizzed past his head. Then he heard Rick shouting in Spanish over the commotion. "I've got him! I've got the little thief!" Rick leapt onto Dak, not only knocking him over, but driving his face into the mud near the fire. "You will pay for what you've done!" Rick screamed in his ear, while at the same time slipping Pakal's codex out of his robe. He traded with Dak on the sly, still screaming at him, and then he slugged Dak right in the jaw. Dak lost his senses for a few seconds, and when he came to, he was holding his face and shouting back at Rick in English, "Dude, that wasn't part of the plan!" But then he looked up and saw 3 Spaniards aiming arrows at his head. Rick threw Dak into a tight headlock and ripped Pakal's codex out of his hands. "I have it," he shouted at the other monks. "Here, take this back to Brother Delanda. I'll see that this thief pays with his life." One of the Spaniards reached for the codex and started toward the preaching man. The other 2 turned their attention elsewhere. As Rick aggressively led Dak away, they both snuck glances behind them until they saw that Delanda had possession of Pakal's codex and had resumed his preaching. "You didn't have to hit me in the jaw," Dak said to Rick. "It was the only way," Rick told him. And then he glanced down at Dak, grinning slightly, and added, "Oh, and I prefer you didn't refer to me as lover boy." Dak rolled his eyes, then ordered Rick to guide him closer to the fire so he could torch the SQ codex. "No one will ever read these lies again," he said. They only made it a few steps closer, though, before getting bowled over. Dak pulled his face from the mud again and looked up. It was Kinich, who shouted, "I saw what you just did!" The SQ codex had fallen out of Rick's robe into the mud, and the 3 of them wrestled for it. "Give it to me!" Kinich shouted. "Now!" He punched Rick in the side of the face and reached for the loose codex, but Dak was too quick. He pounced on it, clutching it to his chest and curling his body into a ball. Kinich slugged him in the kidneys and the back of his head, and then Rick wrestled Kinich's arms behind his back. The rain fell harder. Thunder exploded directly over their heads. Dak squeezed the codex to his chest as Rick and Kinich fell on top of him, ripping and clawing at each other's faces. A monk suddenly hurried over with a raised gun, shouting, "Stop! Stop! Get off him!" Dak relaxed some, assuming the monk was ordering Kinich to get off Rick, but when he looked up, he saw the monk cracking Rick in the back of the head with the butt of his gun. Kinich scurried to his feet and handed over the infinity ring, shouting at the monk, "Throw it into the fire! I'll take care of the codex!" He took the gun from the monk and stuck it into Dak's ear, shouting, "That's right! The SQ has men on both sides!" He shackled Dak's and Rick's wrists and began pushing them away from the square. As they were led away, Dak turned and watched the monk hurrying toward the fire with the ring. "Sera!" Dak shouted. She was beside Bacab now, who was aiming his crossbow at Delanda. He fired an arrow that narrowly missed. 2 monks converged on Delanda immediately, pushing his head down and leading him toward a nearby hut. Dak saw that Delanda was still clutching Pakal's codex. Lightning lit up the massive storm clouds. Thunder pounded so forcefully it shook the earth under Dak's feet. Everywhere he looked, Spaniards were shackling Mayas. The fire roared, all of Itzamal's history quickly turning to ash. He spotted the monk still marching the ring toward the flames. "Sera!" Dak shouted again. Kinich stopped leading him and Rick away long enough to bash the gun against the side of Dak's head. "Quiet!" he shouted. "I don't know how you got out, but I will now get rid of you once and for all. No one can stop our mission." Sera screamed. Dak looked up, saw that she had leapt onto the back of the SQ monk who had the infinity ring. He elbowed her off and kicked her in the gut. "No!" Dak shouted. Kinich smashed him in the ear again. Dak shuddered in pain. He opened his eyes in time to see the monk wind up and heave the ring all the way into the middle of the raging fire. Bacab threw down his crossbow and sprinted right into the fire to retrieve it. He disappeared for several seconds, then came racing back out, his hair unclosed in flames, and tossed the ring to safety. He then dove into the mud and rolled around until the flames were extinguished. He hopped back up, badly burned, and picked up the ring. "Watch out!" Sera screamed from the ground. A Spaniard had stepped out from behind a large boulder, aiming a crossbow right at Bacab. He fired, the arrow burrowing into Bacab's back. Bacab dropped to his knees, arching his back and reaching a hand behind himself, trying to touch the arrow. "Bacab!" Sera shouted, struggling to her feet. The monk reloaded and fired a second arrow, this one sinking into Bacab's right thigh. Dak watched another Mayan man finally pounce on the monk, ripping the crossbow out of his hands, and he watched Sera sprint to Bacab, helping him to his feet, throwing his arm around her shoulder. She started half-carrying him out of the chaotic scene. More lightning flashed. Dak was entirely helpless. Kinich pulled him and Rick behind a hut and threw them on the ground. He raised a gun at them, shouting, "Now you will die!" Dak closed his eyes and waited for the sound of the shot that would end his life. He heard a crashing sound instead, and when he looked up, he saw Maria standing over Kinich's motionless body, holding a large, jagged rock in her hands. Her eyes were full of tears as she looked at Dak and Rick and said, "I will never let Aknah's work be in vain." Dak glanced at Rick, then watched Maria take the gun and keys off Kinich and hurry over to unlock the shackles. She tried several keys before finally inserting the right one and freeing them. Dak flexed his hands for a few seconds, then ripped the SQ codex out of Kinich's limp hands and raced out from behind the hut toward the fire. It was smaller now because the rain was stronger, but Dak knew it would burn the SQ's lies just the same. As he flung the thing deep into the flames, he slipped in the wet mud. He watched from his knees as the fake codex caught fire. Some of the pages twisted under the intense heat, then shriveled up into brittle red and black sheets, the embers eventually breaking off and lifting up into the stormy sky. Now, the world would never know the lies and propaganda of the SQ's codex. They'd learn the truth about the Maya instead. Some of it. Dak breathed heavily as he continued watching the fire. More thunder pounded overhead, and the skies opened up. Rain poured down on Dak's head, flooding the ground around him, forcing the few remaining monks to cower and run for shelter. But Dak couldn't take his eyes off the fire. Yes, they'd fixed the break, but they'd failed to stop Delanda's auto de fe. And Dak was overwhelmed by how much had been lost today. He realized what a vile and violent act it was to destroy a culture's history. It was almost like murder. Lightning lit up the dark storm clouds again. Thunder roared. Dak sensed someone hovering over him, and when he looked up, he found a drenched Rick standing there, holding out his hand to Dak. Chapter 20. Beneath the Ceiba Tree. "Please, just talk to me," Bacab said to Sera. Tears were falling down her cheeks, but she didn't care. Bacab was badly hurt. He said he knew he wouldn't make it, and refused to let her take him to the village medicine man. "Talk about what?" Sera asked, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "It does not matter, little sister. Tell me about your life, your family." Sera watched the way his entire body shivered in the warm, humid air. She looked out from behind the large ceiba tree they had ducked beneath, trying to figure out what she could tell a dying man. Rain poured down all around them. Large drops sometimes slipped through the thick tree leaves and landed on their heads. She had tried the door to the hut in front of them, but it was locked, and nobody had answered when she knocked, even though she was sure there were people inside. "Please," he said, closing his eyes and leaning his head against the trunk of the tree. "Anything." Sera squeezed Bacab's cold hand,
until he opened his eyes again. "It's only me and my Uncle Diego," she said. "No parents?" Bacab asked in a strained voice. Sera shook her head. "I never knew them." The wind picked up, swirling around Sera and Bacab and their tree. The leaves rustled wildly. Sera heard a thick branch snap, but when she looked up, she didn't see anything. "Tell me more," Bacab said. "I had a dream about them," she said, wiping mud from Bacab's brow. "My parents. I was in the future, thousands of years from now, when the world was ending. I went to my uncle's barn and opened the door, and there they were, sitting in chairs, waiting for me." "That's right," Bacab said. Sera wiped the tears from her face again and said, "They came back because they cared about me." "Of course they did." Bacab coughed and reached down to touch the arrow in his thigh. "You will see them again." Sera let out a sob and then quickly stopped herself. "I'm sorry, Bacab. This was all my fault. You were trying to help me." "Since I was a little boy," he said in almost a whisper, "I wanted to be a leader of people. My people." He coughed and wiped his mouth. "My father always warned me, though. He said, 'Bacab, if you want to be someone special, you must have strong shoulders.' I didn't understand. Until now." Sera's heart was pounding in her chest. It was exactly what her grandfather had said to her. The one time they'd met. She stared at Bacab, trying to swallow the lump in her throat. The sky lit up in a massive flash of lightning. Thunder rumbled directly overhead. "What about you, little sister?" Bacab asked. "Do you have strong shoulders?" Sera sobbed again, and this time when she tried to catch herself, she wasn't able to. She just kept on crying. "I think you do," he said, grinning a little. "And I sense things." He coughed hard and then pulled in a deep breath. "About people." Tears streamed down Sera's face, and she tried for a deep breath too, but she couldn't get one. She was too upset. "Bacab," she said. She wanted to say something important, something meaningful and comforting, but the words weren't coming into her head, and all she could think to do was say his name again. "Bacab." When he didn't answer, she let herself sob into her own hands, because she knew he was gone. After several seconds, she leaned his head back against the trunk of the ceiba tree and pushed closed his eyelids. "I'm proud to come from you," she whispered. Then she leaned her head against the tree too and watched the growing storm. A few minutes later, Dak and Rick were there. Dak gripped the infinity ring in his hands. Rick was fiddling with his bracelet. Sera looked up at them, both soaking wet. She wiped her face and climbed to her feet. "Sera," Dak started, but then he noticed Bacab and said, "Oh." Rick gently patted her on the shoulder. "Some of the villagers have warned us that the storm will be getting much worse," he said. "But we can stay here a little longer if you want." "It's a storm," Dak said, "but I don't think it's going to be as bad as they were saying." Sera took the infinity ring from Dak and programmed in the new coordinates Rick showed her on the square. She looked up at Dak and Rick and said, "If the Maya say a great storm is coming, then a great storm is coming." They nodded. "Better hold on, if you're coming with me," she said. Dak and Rick both put their hands on the ring next to hers, and she pushed the button that would send them warping through time yet again. The ring began to vibrate, and the liquid inside lit up and swirled. Sera looked out at the blurring Mayan landscape, feeling sad, but also incredibly full. She turned to look at Bacab.
thinking how the next time someone in school drew her great-great-great-grandmother sitting on a Mayan temple, she would not feel embarrassed. She would feel proud. Everything around them began to blur. Dax said to Rick, "Show her." Rick held up an open locket. Sera expected to see a Mayan glyph in the last second before they warped away, but it was something else altogether. "Is that Chinese?" she asked. Just as Dak opened his mouth to answer, they were whisked away into blackness. This is Dion Graham. We hope that you have enjoyed this production of Infinity Ring, Book 4, Curse of the Ancients, by Matt de la Peña. This program was produced and directed by Scott Sherritt. Executive producer Paul R. Gagney. Post-production by John Van Horn. Recorded by Andrew Thomas and Tyler Whitlatch. Original music by Susan Jane. Text and production copyright 2013 by Scholastic Inc. All rights reserved.